So the features of lean governance or event-driven governance really come down to lean policies, the critical few that move the needle, lean governance processes, consolidate these processes and silos down to a common event model, lean governance event model, which is really to get rid of outlook-driven governance and focus on the event triggers that cause governance to come to life, and then it does its business and goes away. Lean governance organizations replace permanent governance boards with virtual teams. And then another lean governance organizational concept is to implement self-governance and community governance. These features of lean event-driven governance will allow you to rationalize the governance complexity, the number of committees, the oversight process, and you'll be able to actually buy yourself 8 more hours of productive time during the day. Example, we did a governance assessment in a public sector organization a few years ago. Did the organizational assessment of the existing enterprise governance model, and we did this by creating a collage. We put the org chart up, and then we overlaid the different oversight bodies and governance mechanisms, took 5 slides of overlays, and our aha discovery in the analysis was that they had 31 orphan governing committees that still had meetings, coffee and donuts shipped in, had their dutiful, bi-monthly meetings, didn't really have a purpose in the organization. So, I would suspect that a lot of places have orphaned committees and boards that don't serve a purpose, or the flip side, they don't have any. So anyway, that's a good use case of applying lean governance. So the approach to implementing lean is through these 5 steps. We'll go into some cases to show you the application of this approach. 1, focus on fewer meaningful principles and policies and enforce them consistently. So getting to the few that are directly aligned to business strategy and IT strategy will help you govern better. Not every policy has the same weight, and too many policies leads to conflicting policies. And what you'll find, and something I've always wanted to do, I just haven't gotten an organization to bite off on it yet, but if you take an organization and if you were able to get your hands on all of the policy documentation that exists, and if you were able to collapse that into a big data repository and run some Hadoop on that, some MapReduce, for example, what you would start to see is that these policies have accumulated over time like scar tissue, some superseding old ones, some directly conflicting with older ones, some enhancements to older ones. So if you were able to ever take and inventory all of the policy stuff in an organization, especially of some size, you would probably be able to rationalize the policy set by 50%. And then, based on getting to the 50% that are still relevant, prioritize those into ABCs, and then you could start to reallocate the decision model for those policies in such a way that this lean governance model becomes operational for your organization. Something to keep in mind. Step 2 is create the governance event model and replace standing meetings with governance events. So this is the whole get rid of the outlook-driven model of governance today, which is meetings and committees. So focus on where are the governance events that matter that we could use to trigger the oversight process, and let's get as few of these events as possible, but collapse and consolidate all the governance activities so that they can take advantage of these events to govern. Step 3, convert permanent committees into virtual teams, which are triggered by governance events, by governance triggers. 4, implement trust-based concepts. We'll go into a little bit more detail about these, and that's, again, self-governance, community governance ideas. But you've got to design them in, right? You just can't say, well, we're going to implement self-governance and, off into the sunset singing Kumbaya you go. Not going to happen. You've got to design in explicitly how you want to self-govern and allow that to take place. And you've got to design in community governance so that that can be effective. And you'll also still need some top-down prescriptive for certain critical policy areas too. So it's not one way or the other. It's a blended model of all 3 concepts. 5th, and finally, collapse all of your governance silos down into this common event-driven governance framework. That will allow you to collapse the infrastructure and rickety committee-driven approach of your governance model today. Let's go into some details. Lean governance policy model. Again, the idea here is focus on key policy domains and key policy areas. Not every policy matters. Not every policy is an critical policy. Compliance and risk has a body of policies from a compliance and risk perspective. And if you go talk to the compliance and risk people in an organization, while they may feel all their policies are vitally important, the fact is they have, if you were to partition them into A, B, Cs, they would have a set of A's that really, really, really matter. You'd have some B policies that matter, but not as much as the A's, and they're going to have some C's that are less critical. And if you can prioritize the policy domains and policy areas this way, what you'll be able to do is then focus on the ones that really, really matter. So focus on the key policy domains and key policies. Focus on the minimum policy set that enables the targeted business performance, the IT governance, and coverage for compliance and risk. So we're not saying don't govern. We're saying govern effectively with things that really matter. Step 3 in this, the third bullet here on this slide is develop coarse-grained policies for enforcement with the fine-grained details that you need for the definitional purposes. But the idea is to have a coarser-grained policy that can be enforced very simply rather than having somebody read lots of fine print in a fine-grained policy. And we'll go into the difference between coarse and fine-grained in a few. So the last step under this lean governance policy model is to publish and communicate the governance requirements so that you can achieve self-governance and community governance. So those groups and teams know the rules of the road. If the policies are defined explicitly and they're publicized, you can implement self-governance because people know what the policy requirements are. Put them out there in a repository. Invite them for comment and scrutiny. Instead of having it as this black book of secrets that you clobber performance teams over the head with in the typical police state view of governance today. So fewer policies enforced well are more valuable than a ton of policies that are not enforced at all. Now this reminds me of the cheese policy story. A couple of years ago, out of the federal government, there were two agencies that had a cheese policy. One was the FDA, which says too much cheese is bad for you and because of cholesterol content, so eat less cheese. Then there's another policy organization that really wanted you to eat more cheese because obviously they're pushing dairy consumption in the dairy states. So we had two conflicting cheese policies coming out of the federal government. So that's a case where we've got to come up with the right cheese policy that is the cheese policy and make it the one and get rid of the others. But in that example, and that was a couple of years ago in the papers and stuff, it was kind of humorous, but the fact that we had conflicting cheese policies coming out of the federal government, probably not a surprise, but if you think about it in the terms of an enterprise that has some oversight requirements on it, you don't want to have conflicting policies with respect to the cheese domain or some other domain. So quick story there. Step 2, lean governance processes and events. So the idea, again, is to use event-driven governance to implement this whole lean governance idea. Events are driven through identifying the governance event model. You need to find in your organization the triggers that will cause the governance process to take place. So the key events, for example, are SDLC phase gates. We used that example before, and we'll come back to that example in a few minutes. If you're using Agile development in your organization, Agile ceremonies are ideal trigger events to do IT governance over Agile or scaled Agile. And in fact, we've developed a model for this earlier this year that we're getting a lot of interest in from some pretty major organizations because you can effectively integrate scaled Agile development with IT governance processes in a way that doesn't slow down the Agile delivery process, but yet in a way that allows transparent oversight of the software products being developed through the Agile delivery process. So that's just something to keep in mind. And we've also used that same idea to implement compliance and risk governance in an organization. Compliance and risk oversight can be used, can be done via this event-driven model. And also change management processes can be triggered using a governance event kind of a model as well. Keep those in mind. So the whole idea is to identify the events in your governance enterprise and use those events to trigger the governance model. That's how you streamline it and collapse it down. From an organizational model perspective, we've emphasized get rid of permanent boards, replace them with virtual teams. Implement at the most a 3 to 4 tier organizational design, again, only after you've got the policies and processes and events sorted out. But if you go with a 3-tier design, at minimum, 2 of those tiers have to be self-governance and community governance. So if you make, if you have a 3-tier design and 2 of the teams or 2 of the tiers are the self-governance layer and the community governance layer, that's a pretty skinny governance model. And if you push the policy enforcement down into the community and self-governance, the layers, what you're going to find is governance decisions will be faster. People will be more interested and willing to go through governance because they have some degree of empowerment, and it makes it skinny. If you have a 4-tier design, again, half the tiers should be comprised of the self-governance tier and the community governance tier, and then the other 2 can be increasingly more senior management involved, but they should still be virtual trigger-based teams to mostly handle exceptions and escalations. So this way you're trying to push the operational day-to-day governance down to the community layer and the self-governing layer, and then only invoke the very busy executive teams for exceptions. That is a way to make a governance model empowered, lean, and efficient. And again, all these governance boards and committees are triggered by governance events. So let's talk about what these self-governing concepts are, self-governance and community governance. Let's talk about that. The idea is that a self-governance team can be very speedy and empowered to make governance decisions. You can empower individuals and working teams to make decisions. They will be able to self-govern and govern for the policies that you empower them to govern, like enterprise architecture policies, like certain technology policies, design patterns, reuse policies, things of that nature. And that's not the end of it. There's a lot of policies that a empowered project team can self-govern around. You just have to define them and let them know what they can and can't do. But the other part of self-governance at the team level is that you've got to have a trust but verify framework. So you need the but verify process so that even if they self-govern and certify that they've applied and met all the governance requirements, you're going to periodically audit or review decisions at the team level and either sample or 100%, but you're going to want to at least, have a trust but verify kind of a concept. And that's how you can make this work. Now, the community governance model, which is the next major bullet down, is based on open source governance. It allows for collaboration, coordination, and speed and trust. And again, a community governance model is basically a virtual team of respected subject matter experts that are recognized as the experts in the organization, can make decisions on behalf of leadership, and can provide the trust but verify oversight for the self-governing teams. So you can imagine who these people are in your organization. But if you build from the bottom up self-governance and community governance, what you're going to find is you can push a lot of your policy oversight down to these 2 layers in a very virtual way, and it'll work. Now, the last step is collapse the silos to a governance framework, and that's really when we get this event-driven model in place, you can collapse enterprise architecture, PMO, portfolio management, budgeting, specific domain technical governance, and even compliance and risk and security and privacy onto this common model. You can get rid of the silos. You can govern using the fundamentally same approach for everything. And that means, again, you're consolidating your total enterprise governance requirements to a shared event model so that you can actually do business governance along the same lines. That's the whole philosophy of this, is using that event-driven model. Now let's do a use case. IT governance is what I'm showing here. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. So so that we get to the punchline. This just shows a generic IT governance life cycle, starting on the left with IT strategic planning and investment planning. Out of that, vertically comes the strategic goals and objectives. That feeds into the governance design and renewal process. That feeds into the next blue box down, extra project governance. I sometimes call it EXO project governance. It's the governance activities that are not part of managing projects, but they're managing things like portfolio management, PMO, acquisition, vendor management, enterprise architecture governance. It is, again, that's not project specific. Those things apply to all projects. Out of the strategic planning process comes a set of new programs and projects and initiatives, which then start the project-centric governance activities at the bottom. So that's where you do project governance, architecture alignment, enterprise architecture governance, portfolio alignment, SDLC governance, et cetera. And then, that work gets done, it kicks over to the right where you're doing ops and sustainment and feedback. So that's kind of a good generic enterprise governance life cycle for IT. These, again, are the words that go with the phases. But I've just described them for you, so I'm going to move on. The whole idea is if you look across that life cycle, each of these areas offer a set of events that can be used to apply governance. The strategic planning process, represented by the red star there, provides an event for governing. And that event is, okay, we've got our new strategic plan. Are there any impacts or changes to the policies and governance model? That's a trigger for a refresh of governance. Same with EXO project governance here. There's triggers in this process that would trigger things like the PMO process. IT acquisition processes are great triggers to enforce governance oversight. Vendor management processes provide triggers that would allow you to latch governance processes on. So all these stars point to areas where there are natural triggers and events. So governance events in our model are scheduled or ad hoc checkpoints that provide the opportunity for visibility and transparency of governance and the opportunity to ensure alignment to principles and policies. So event-driven governance depends on the identification and enablement of this kind of a governance event model. You're looking for the triggers that can be used to invoke that governance model. Again, invoke the model, let it do its business, and then it goes away. So these are kinds of governance events that happen in every enterprise: strategic planning, phase gate reviews, SDLC governance gates, compliance and risk requirements, program reviews, enterprise architecture reviews, scope reviews for requirements with the business stakeholders, so on and so forth. There are natural events in your enterprise that can be used as a trigger for governance. This example here is showing a budgeting and resource allocation process triggering a review of projects and programs that would lead to an update of the portfolios, an update to enterprise architecture, an update on the IT service management processes, an update to ops and sustainment, for example. So the idea is a budgeting process might be a useful trigger to review new projects and programs and do portfolio management. At the same time, this kind of a process for requirements and investment planning and resource allocation of new projects and programs it can trigger these other related governance requirements across an SDLC. So I can do program reviews, architecture reviews, portfolio alignments as driven by SDLC phase gates shown at the bottom. So every time I am at a new phase gate, I'm not enforcing all of the same governance every time, although I could. All I'm doing is using that trigger to bring in what governance is needed at that point in time based on how we want to design our governance model. So again, SDLC phase gates provide useful triggers. Now, principles and policies become tricky. I've said before, you want fewer policies, enforce better. So it's important to think about principles, coarse-grained policies, and fine-grained policies. Principles are high-level statements of intent that inform and guide decision-making. They are enforceable in and of themselves. If you align to a principle, or if there's clear misalignment to a principle, you can shut something down. Principles decompose into coarse-grained policies that basically align with strategic goals and the governing principles, and those decompose into fine-grained policies that are very specific within specified policy domains. So here's a good picture of how this continuum of principle, policy, granularity works. I've got strategic inputs or direction coming in from the left. I've got a set of governing principles that help me drive or meet that strategic direction. In this case, I'm showing cost controls and IT efficiencies. A set of governing principles that support that are reuse, portfolio management, application consolidation, stronger enterprise architecture governance, and PMO governance, for example. Well, out of those principles, I would define a set of coarse-grained, simple policies that help us enforce those. And then for each of those coarse-grained policies, I'll have more fine-grained descriptions and documentation of those policies. And the whole idea and theory behind lean governance is to have fewer policies and enforce them at the coarsest level of granularity possible. That way, I don't need to enforce a policy by reading 300 pages of technical documentation. I might be able to enforce the policy at the principle level or the coarse-grained level. That makes it easier to govern. Now, policy threads are the idea of connecting multiple policies together and governing them with a single event. We came up with the idea of policy threads years ago. The idea is a governance event trigger can be used to govern multiple related oversight processes at the same time. And this example here is a reuse policy I'm using just for fun. Now, service-oriented architecture governance has a policy of service reuse, but a reuse policy is even a higher order of magnitude at the portfolio management level. We don't want two or more of the same kind of functional system, for example. So a reuse policy is, let's leverage a single process in a single system. So a reuse policy thread is represented by that red star being the trigger, and that would then invoke a policy thread that forces reuse across the strategic planning process, across the budgeting process, across the portfolio management process, across the PMO, across sourcing, enterprise architecture, specific domain governance requirements, and at the acquisition level. So you can imagine lots of ways in which an orchestrated policy thread can enforce a related policy across multiple domains of governance. The whole idea is events will help you identify these threads. The threads will help you consolidate and integrate and streamline governance. And that's really what this slide says. The benefit of the policy thread approach is that a single event can be used to orchestrate the connected and coordinated governance across silos, so you don't have separate silos of governance. You've got an integrated approach. So if you collapse governance to events and thread, identify these coarse-grained policies that matter, map them to the events, the governance event model, orchestrate the big threads across the enterprise, collapse your governance processes down to that common event model, and replace these permanent goals with self-governance and community governance, you'll be able to do this. You'll be able to take out a lot of the friction and overhead of your governance model. Here's another use case. Scaled Agile, governance for Agile governance. So the events in Agile are the Agile ceremonies. So when you're doing product planning in Agile, or release planning in Agile, or sprint planning in Agile, or even backlog grooming in Agile, those are natural governance events to apply IT governance to the scaled Agile process. A lot of people say, you can't do that. You can't govern Agile. It'll slow it down. Well, we've proven with a new process design framework based on this event-driven governance model that you can implement scaled Agile and govern it using an event-driven governance model. The key is to use these Agile ceremonies as the event triggers, and then use those event triggers to drive a consolidated, streamlined IT governance model. And again, what we've done in applying this to scaled Agile is a three-tiered governance organizational design that heavily relies on self-governance at the Scrum team level, community governance at the Scrum of Scrum teams level, and then if needed, an enterprise committee to handle exceptions at the top. So that's another good use case for this. In this kind of a model, as this picture shows, you can use the identical IT governance processes and govern waterfall or Agile using the exact same model. You don't need a separate model for both, and you can govern both very, very well without slowing either down. Of course, it's impossible to imagine slowing waterfall down any more than it already is, but I'm being facetious. Now, this offers the opportunity to go back to that governance lifecycle I showed before to collapse business and IT to a common framework, business and IT governance consolidation. I'm showing business planning tying to IT planning. I'm showing business governance tying to IT governance. I'm showing business execution and IT project execution being related, and business operations and IT ops being connected. So that's the idea that this concept enables. So the approach to lean governance, I'll reiterate, is these 5 steps. Focus on fewer principles and policies and enforce them well. Create a governance event model to replace standing meetings with events. Convert permanent committees to virtual teams triggered by those governance events. Implement trust-based governance concepts, specifically self-governance and community governance. And then look for ways to collapse your silos of governance down into this common event-driven framework. In this way, as you can see, you can start to replace silos of governance with events that connect these metaphorical gears of governance so that it's a well-tuned machine rather than a set of separate silos asking for more of your valuable time. So the benefits of this should be pretty clear by now. Benefits of event-driven governance are the opportunity to kill off governance silos. It's the ability to drive a standard governance reference model based on events. It's the idea that if you just get your governing principles and policies to a very few and enforce them very well and make sure they're aligned to business and IT strategy, you're going to see the results. Orchestrating and coordinating via policy events and policy threads that lets you collapse and consolidate governance. This helps you get to an agile, lean, right-sized governance organizational design, primarily centered on virtual teams. It focuses on critical performance-based criteria rather than the police state criteria. And lastly, it empowers your organization. It pushes trust down and enables self-governance and community governance. If you get self-governance and community governance in your enterprise, you'll be able to scale your governance model very well. So, things to do tomorrow. Do an assessment. Do a lean governance assessment. We actually have a framework for doing a lean governance assessment. Assess your model and find out if you've got too many policies. Determine if you've got too many overhead board committees. Figure out what your enforcement processes are and look for ways to consolidate. Design a lean and event-driven governance model. So look for ways to consolidate, centralize, and coordinate all of your enterprise governance using an event-driven design. Implement this lean governance kind of idea for as many areas as you can. IT governance, compliance and risk. Integrate just the domains within compliance and risk and you'll be happier. And then look for areas to collapse and consolidate your silos down into this design. We know how to do this. We've done this a lot of times. So this Manifesto webinar is a new approach. It's an enhancement of the previous version a couple of years ago. The new ebook will go into more details on this. Look at doing an assessment. We're actually offering lean governance workshops that we're going to start doing, and we have a lean governance playbook to guide as a methodology. So the lean governance playbook really is an assessment, design, rollout, optimization, kind of a 4-step process. And this is all about implementing the lean governance manifesto for all these areas of governance. These workshops I mentioned, 2-day lean governance workshops to train your team and identify opportunities. 4-day lean governance design workshops are training and then application of lean governance principles to your organization. And in 2015, we're going to start offering a certification on the lean governance concepts for people that are interested in getting that kind of a certification. So the summary here, and I know we're short of time, is take charge of your governance future. This event-driven model will simplify your governance. It will allow you to collapse it. It will allow you to streamline the organizational model. It will allow you to make it event-based and demand-based, and you'll see the results very rapidly. So let's take questions now if there are any, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation today.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So we did have a couple of questions come in. The first one was, what about governance of acquisitions and contracting processes, or contracting?
Yeah, it works the same. So if you use this process, for example, across the DoD 5002 or the Intel version of the acquisition lifecycle, same thing. You can use an event-driven model to trigger that oversight so that you're not having separate program governance taking place while you're doing the acquisition oversight to it. In fact, we've done a lot of work in acquisition governance with Air Force, so we know the 5002 processes intimately well. We can implement those.
Great. Our second question was, how did you deal with the cultural resistance issues you might have encountered from the traditional process and governance people?
Well, the cultural issue is the center of this thing, and I am a wayward anthropologist, so I know a little bit about that. This is the whole idea behind self-governance and community governance is you push the trust. And if you can create a trust-based, empowered workforce to self-govern, that'll get the culture of governance in a different place. But right now, the culture of governance in a lot of places is it's distrusted, it's overhead, it's the police state, it's it's that kind of. So the trust, the culture in an organization can be shifted if you empower them and use a trust-based design.
Great, thank you. So we actually are out of time right now, and so we are going to have to wrap this up. But on the screen, everybody, you can see how to reach us by email. So if you do have any further questions, please feel free to forward them to the email. So we'd like to take a moment to thank everyone for joining us today. If you are interested in learning any more about AgilePath's capabilities and solutions, please visit our website at agilepath.com. Again, that's right on the screen there. Thank you again for attending this AgilePath webinar, and have a great day.